You are the beautiful community, and whether you like it or not, you're stuck in this analysis reaction video to Lex Fridman's interview with Vladimir Zelensky. Now, we're going to do this in a weird way. I'm going to watch a bit, and then we'll react. I'll watch a bit, and then we'll react. That'll give a freshness to our exploration and analysis, but it'll also mean that I don't know where I'm going to land in terms of my conclusions about the interview. So let's get going with Lex's first line that follows up his pre-interview request to have the interview in Russian, and we spoke about this by pointing out that yes, you can be pushy around why you prefer a particular option. If you're a professional journalist, which Lex is not, is a long-form conversationalist, but the same ethics apply, as long as you acknowledge that you might be asking for something that's too sensitive or unrealistic or unprecedented. But in the end, even though you can make a case for it, you can't dictate to the subject of the interview what language the interview will be in. It's always for them to choose among the options you've given them. And it can be normal practice to try to refresh or re-legislate your request at the beginning of the interview, and Lex does that. So he begins in Russian, then he says, could we explain why the Ukrainian language is so important while speaking Russian, and that way have an excellent conversation in Russian? So Lex says this in Russian, and Zelensky responds in Russian. I have wonderful command of Russian. I get you. But 73 strikes today, missile strikes. And this is a daily story. And the people striking us speak Russian. And the people being struck are told by the people doing the striking that the striking is in defense of Russian speakers. I don't respect the leader of today's Russia or the people there. There is no need to pretend nothing is happening and give a convenient pass to Putin, who says we are one people. At the start of the war, I addressed Russians and zero response. They are mute and they don't hear. If I am honest, I despise them. Then Lex asks in Russian, can I ask some questions in Russian? And Zelensky says, yes, of course, we can do a little bit of, blended mix. I'll speak Ukrainian and English primarily, but you can ask questions in any language you want, and I will answer in Russian from time to time if you really want me to or need that, or you want to bypass the translation. So let's do a little bit of a tactical analysis of that and then do a bit of social analysis. And this will take us through the first sort of quarter hour, 20 minutes of the interview. If you were advising Zelensky on what language option to pick, what would you tell him? And Zelensky had three options, and he chose the right one. The first option was to speak exclusively Russian. The second option was to speak English and Ukrainian without a word of Russian. And the third option, the correct one, was to speak Ukrainian English with a tiny bit of Russian thrown in while centering the Ukrainian and the English responses and not bothering what language Lex uses to ask the questions. So why was this the right choice? Well, the case for speaking in Russian is there, but it's overwhelmingly outweighed by considerations against it. The considerations for it are, first of all, that is the language in which they would have the best conversation. Now you might say, well, hang on, I constantly see conversations in translation. Zelensky constantly does conversations in translation. Most of his English interviews are 30% Ukrainian, 70% Ukrainian, 30% English. So it's a completely normal practice. What's the issue there? Well, if you speak to journalists who interview world leaders, they will almost invariably say that yes, it's common practice, but it's a bit of a nightmare. You get so much less. You can't dance with the subject of the interview in the same way. The result is most of the time significantly inferior. So it's a bit nightmarish and quite inorganic. And that's about it. I suppose the other argument for speaking in Russian would be pretty weak. And it would just turn out to be an argument for not being rigid about saying a couple of words in Russian. And that's the argument that might say, well, look, the Russians are aggressive and intolerant, but we're relaxed. We can speak a bit of Russian too, if you like. Russians don't own Russian, and we're the tolerant ones, and we want to join the West, and the Russians are weird and intolerant, and screw them. So as a way of differentiating Ukraine from Russia, you could argue that speaking in Russian may have made sense, but that's a very weak argument. And fundamentally, the case for not speaking Russian is very clear for two reasons. First of all, it's just a non-starter when it comes to domestic politics. Secondly, when it comes to Zelensky communicating something to a Western audience, first, it's good for him to speak a bit in English to an English-speaking audience. But second, more importantly, there is a risk of Zelensky giving the impression, if he were to speak Russian, that the difference between Russians, Ukrainians, and who knows who they really are isn't that big, and this is a little bit of a skirmish over the narcissism of minor difference on the ex-Soviet space that we should allow it to resolve by itself. Now, you don't need that argument because it's anyway impossible politically from a domestic point of view for Zelensky to speak in Russian, but that's a strong argument, whereas the argument that speaking Russian is somehow a demonstration of your tolerance and independence from the nastiness of Putin, that's really weak. So that settles the speaking in Russian. Now, what about speaking only in Ukrainian and English? Well, in the context of a 3-hour semi-informal, semi-political interview, it'll just make you come off rigid and inauthentic and unrelaxed. So Zelensky absolutely chose the correct option. Now let's do a little bit of social analysis, but not much because we want to get on with the interview. What's going on here when Zelensky says stuff like, I despise Russian people? Now, before I give a social analysis of that, psychologically, does he mean that? Or is this political speech? It's to a large extent political speech. Zelensky doesn't entirely mean that. Now, the social analysis that's really important is that there are 3 forms of nationalism in Ukraine, and it's astounding that I may be the first person telling you this, because it demonstrates how little adequate conversation about Ukraine there is in the West. It also illustrates Ukraine's struggles to have an open conversation with itself. Now, the first type of nationalism in Ukraine is civic nationalism, the idea that you come together with a sense of your own history around a set of inclusive, pluralistic, democratic principles that inspire solidarity through difference of an inclusive kind. And that's a resplendent kind of nationalism when you can get it going, right? There are different types of benign nationalism, by the way, and we'll have a separate conversation about that. And of course, that kind of civic nationalism in Ukraine can be an inspiring model for us in the West because we are so bad at reconciling, for instance, some progressive projects with patriotism, right? How do you make the patriotic case for a change in taxation policy, for a change in immigration policy? And one of the things that I always robustly insist on is that people on the internationalist liberal center, people on the left who want to do without patriotism in their political argument, are free riders. You can't do without it if you want to do serious politics, right? You want to post Trump? You can only do it through patriotism. You can only do it through making a case that in part scoops up the notion that we are Americans and we can do better than this. So, civic nationalism. The second type of nationalism that's prominent and to a degree increasingly prominent in Ukraine is ethno-nationalism. And ethno-nationalism is not sharply distinguishable from civic nationalism, but it is a separate entity in some significant respects. And it can take more or less constructive or destructive forms. It always has a propensity to take destructive forms. That's a second type of nationalism you have in Ukraine, ethno-nationalism. And the third kind of nationalism you have in Ukraine is the fake nationalism of Western hyper-identity politics imported into Ukraine. So the first two types of nationalism are organic to Ukraine. The second is a social media-driven foreign import that drives a lot of the slogans around decolonization and decommunization that you see on Twitter that do not necessarily represent how most Ukrainians feel. So these are the three types, and the conversation of how they interact with each other is a very important conversation to have. And it's funny that even describing this elementary sort of panorama of the threads in Ukrainian politics is already a bit striking to you, because for all of the centering of Ukraine in the Western pro-Ukrainian internet, I'd gamble that most people in our algorithmic bubble, though they center Ukraine, they still probably know more about Russia than Ukraine. That's a little bit strange. Now, some of you clearly know more about Ukraine than you do about Russia. But think about it. There's a lot of people watching this, right, who vehemently support Ukraine. But if I asked you to write me 2 paragraphs about Patrushev, you could. If I asked you to write me 2 paragraphs about Yermak, you couldn't. Interesting. Well, let's go on now, otherwise we'll be here all day. 1 hour, 20 minutes in. What's going on? Well, I am left wanting more. So much more. Either more emotion, a more psychological interview, or more poetry, a more Werner Herzog type interview, or more political substance. And I don't care which one of the 3 I get more of, but I need more of one of them for this interview to be stylistically mature. And I don't care what it is stylistically. It doesn't need to be a journalistic political interview. It could be anything. But then the answer is, well, maybe Lex can do that in 5 years, in 10 years. But I'm left wanting more. Now, I am listening to this in the original recording, which is perhaps 70% Ukrainian, 20% English, 10% Russian. I have switched over for a few moments to the AI translation in English, but not enough to make an assessment of it. What I heard contained a couple of mistakes, but I can't make an overall judgment as I'm mostly on the original tape. Now, let's get into this a little bit. Zelensky, whatever you think of him, and there's much to criticize about him right now, is a great political leader because of what he did in the opening stage of the war, because he stayed, and because the full-scale invasion is an extraordinary event in European history. He is at the center of an extraordinary historical drama. So I want to step into it in some way, maybe politically, maybe emotionally, maybe poetically, but I want in. Do I get anything? Yes, I do. I get a very interesting response from Zelensky about how much communication mattered to him, how he understood the importance, the power, the symbolism of curating his communication, making it clear that he's staying, making it clear that the government is functioning. And you remember the video. I am here, he's here, he's here, they're here, we're here. So I wanted more. And it was palpable that in these opening days, Zelensky went a very significant psychological evolution and was at a rapid pace developing ownership over himself, including physical ownership, right? He had a great deal of physical ownership in certain respects, but he didn't have the kind of physical ownership that could hold a country. He had the physical ownership that could hold a room. So I wanted more. Coming out of this discussion of the opening stages of the war, Zelensky says, I also tried to speak in Russian to Russians and they didn't hear me and they don't hear me now. And here Lex comes in and says, I don't agree. I guarantee some will listen, even Putin. And Zelensky responds in Russian, Putin is in substance a deaf man. He can't listen. And Lex says, but you must always talk. And Zelensky responds by saying, well, do you think Putin really wants to end the war? I think this is naive. And here Zelensky is again speaking English. Your language is very naive. I'm so sorry, it's naive that he wants to finish the war. He could be made to want to finish the war by pressure from Trump. However, Lex comes back. Maybe I have a naive dream that you'll sit with Trump and Putin and figure out a way to peace. And that may require both carrots and sticks. Zelensky says, well, let's talk about ceasefire. Think about the terrible things the Russians have done, the terrible things they're doing in the occupied territories, and think about our need for security guarantees, right? That we need to be in a position of strength that includes security guarantees to meaningfully bring the conflict to a halt. And then Zelensky says, Trump will run into some of the problems that I ran into in 2019 when I wanted to negotiate with Putin, but my view was that Putin didn't want to negotiate. And Trump will run into the problem of a Putin that doesn't really want to negotiate. Zelensky is claiming that. And he then added that Putin will try to go out of his way to make me and Trump quarrel. Lex comes back. But can we talk about security guarantees for Russia? And Zelensky says, the global south often give on the one hand, on the other hand, account of what's happening, a bit like you are doing. But remember, this is our first meeting. In the second meeting, you're going to be more on our side. And also remember that for all of the equivocation, much of the global south, much of the so-called global south, recognizes that Putin started the war and that it was a mistake of his to do so. Zelensky speaking. And Lex says, but I want to find a path to peace, and for that we must start in the middle. And you're smart, Mr. Zelensky, you must know that. Zelensky says, by the way, your Russian is only so-so. You're struggling with it a little, which is a tease and a zing, but also kind of an observation that has a modicum of truth. Lex spoke Russian really well for somebody who left at 12, but he doesn't quite occupy the language psychologically. Now notice, occupying a language psychologically is different to speaking it fluently, and is even different to speaking it fluently without an accent. There are lots of people who left their country, let's say at the age of 8 or 11, who still speak their original language without an accent, but are kind of aliens in it. And you felt that with Lex, not because he made some minor grammatical mistakes, like talking about doing decisions. When you don't do decisions, you make decisions, but because he wasn't fully at home in the language. And you could see moments when it's really a brain that would grasp Russian speech internally very, very well, but when producing it engaged in a little bit of translation and a little bit of sentence construction that is psychologically foreign to Russian culture. Now, having zinged Lex, Zelensky gets a response from Lex. Well, one solution to the conflict would be to take both Russia and Ukraine into NATO. And at this point, we just assume that Lex is trying to provoke a thought or some reflection from Zelensky rather than actually meaning it. But even if he means it to the degree of 20%, I certainly have a problem with that thought, because it's not a bad thought. It's not a political thought at all. It's just a thought that bypasses political reality and emanates from a kind of seraphic moral aspiration that doesn't run through the nitty-gritty of actual political agency in the real political world. And insofar as that is a serious remark, I certainly don't want to join, as a British citizen, any military alliance with Mr. Putin. And then Zelensky says something quite generic about how if Ukraine is in NATO, then that will be the security guarantee for Russia, because NATO is a defensive alliance. And Lex pushes Zelensky, says, look, but NATO might not be one of the outcomes that's realistic. And then Zelensky says in English, and I'm quoting, this is a significant thing to say, we don't need guarantees without the United States. Without the United States, there are no security guarantees which can prevent Russian aggression. And that's a significant remark, because as things stand, Zelensky is certainly not heading for a reality with US security guarantees. In some of what we've heard from Zelensky, particularly around NATO, you mustn't forget how far he is addressing a domestic audience. Even if he's speaking to Lex, he's still addressing a domestic audience that is caught between a conception of victory that has collapsed, which is territorial reacquisition, and the new conception of victory, a conception of an adequate outcome that hasn't been formed yet. May the force be with me. Speak to you in a bit. Now let's talk hour 1:20 till the 2.5 hour point. And then round up and give Zelensky a score for his performance. Now, as they talk about all the things that you have to let go, like the fact that Putin is not going to be, sent to The Hague, Lex begins to talk about letting things go, and he says, lots of things are not a small compromise, and forgiving is not a small compromise. Right? A very naive remark. And here Zelensky is at his strongest in response. He says, look, if you're a dad and you've lost children in the war, it's not about forgiving, right? Nobody's going to forgive, right? What are we talking about here? And Zelensky used plenty of swear words here and gave a very, very convincing rebuttal to that naive statement. That's Zelensky at his best, right? Articulating the justified outrage and articulating the sickness and toxicity of Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine. Zelensky is at his best when it comes to that. Now, Zelensky then goes on to say, well, Putin is a nutter in not so many words. And Lex comes back and says, well, if you want to negotiate with a political leader, you just have to view him as a serious person who loves his country and loves his people. And here Zelensky keeps on being at his best. He says, what country does he love? I mean, he's claimed that Ukraine is his country, and tomorrow he'll claim that America is his country. What is that guy on about? He sends these 18-year-old kids to the front who are more or less children, and they've lost hundreds of thousands, the Russians. What kind of love for your country is that? He has a love, and his love is for his inner circle. It's not that he got invaded by fascists and he had to send these kids to the front. This guy doesn't love his country. And then there's a controversy that arose from the latter part of the interview, and that is that the generally not bad AI translation contained quite a number of slips, and one of them was that when Zelensky was talking in Ukrainian about striking folks on the arm when they engage in corruption, that got translated as a spank on the wrist. The meaning of it in Ukrainian is much more like give it to them proper on the arm so they don't do it again, right? So it's a completely different meaning from spank somebody on the wrist, which sounds like a reprimand that could almost contain an element of encouragement. And lots of people got a little bit of virality of that on Twitter X. The truth is, no serious person listening to the interview as a whole, right, without this being 11 seconds cut out of context, could possibly fail to misunderstand what Zelensky means there. In the context, even if you are listening to the English AI translation and you're hearing a spank on the wrist, which he says a couple of times, you are absolutely clear that he doesn't mean a spank on the wrist, but means something more significant. That's pretty obvious. The problem with a bit of a mistranslation like that is that, cut out into a little short here and there, that could be less nice. But in the context of of any stretch of 5 or 10 minutes, you cut in around when Zelensky says that, there's no issue there. So how do we begin concluding this? I can't give Lex a mark out of 10 for this because the whole experience was for me too pre-stylistic. Maybe Lex has matured now to a level where he has a style of his own as an interviewer, which he's still developing as a conversationalist. But when it comes to politics, it's pre-stylistic. I can't analyze it in terms of stylistic criteria. It's not journalism, but it's also not mature poetically. It's not mature emotionally. So maybe 10 years from now, Lex can do something politically. But even on the basis of some of the questions we've seen, this is very much sort of Lex as a political conversationalist still being in the pre-teen period, and there's no reason he can't grow and develop. But I can't give a mark there. There's no stylistic maturity. Zelensky is going to get for this performance a 7. I think that there's a lot that he did really, really well. So why isn't it a 9? It's not a 9 because Zelensky rather cast Putin as either a kind of Hitler figure or a figure who is, and this is what Zelensky literally said in the interview, hoping to start wars on the entirety of the ex-Soviet space. That's at best unpersuasive to a Western listener, right? So, we often talk about why Putin might challenge Article 5, but you need to make that case properly. Saying that Putin is going to fight all over the ex-Soviet space when he's running out of military capacity, commensurate with anything like that kind of enterprise, is implausible, and people are not going to quite take that seriously. So that's the first thing. And the second thing was, I think, just how much there was a tone of the West has systematically failed us. The West didn't react early enough to the Putin problem, and the West has failed us. There's a lot of truth in that, but I don't think that was a successful part of the message, especially when it's not complemented by any strategic clarity from Zelensky himself about what's to come over the next 6 months. Now, that's bloody tough of an ask from Zelensky, because he is in the position of this extraordinarily sort of vulnerable, precarious dependence on the United States. But nevertheless, if I'm Ukrainian, I am wanting much more strategic clarity from my leader, and he's certainly not getting a 7 for that kind of communication. Because, to a good extent, we're looking at a leader who is strategically stuck in 2002, 2022, 2023, and remains one of the greatest, maybe the greatest political leader of the 21st century so far for what he did in the early stages of the war. But today, I have more questions than a 7 out of 10 score if I were Ukrainian. But we're talking about how this is addressed to a Western audience. And I think aside from the two flaws of not enough clarity in his strategic vision combined with complaint about the West's systemic failure, one hand, and then also a somewhat sort of sloppy and loose statement about how Putin is going to conquer the whole ex-Soviet space, that brings it down to a 7 rather than a 9. A 9 would be some extra strategic clarity, and then a clearer conversation about Putin's intent. And I think that Zelensky appropriately centered Putin's intent. He said the thing that's really important for Trump is that Trump has a proper understanding of Putin, implying he doesn't have that yet. But you can't just say that Putin is going to invade the entirety of the ex-Soviet space. You need to say, I believe he could challenge Article 5 in this and that way. We make that case, quite frankly. On the main channel, I make that case. But you've got to make it. You can't just say Putin's going to start, 4 wars against different countries on the ex-Soviet space. That doesn't sound plausible. So that's why I'm at 7. But overall, I think 7 is a clear win. So I think this, on balance, I would say went quite well for Mr. Zelensky. Lots of love.